We were talking about mindfulness, and you did quite a quick demolition job, as I remember, of mindfulness. But there's this other kind of entity in the spiritual sphere that we call, or some people call, self-inquiry, which is, I suppose, a bit like mindfulness, but what you're doing is you're looking for the looker.
Yes.
You're kind of seeking out, and through persistent observation, the idea, I suppose, is that looker is seen through, and so through the efforts of your labour, you can somehow attain to this kind of non-self state that we seem to be talking about here.
Yes.
Discuss.
Oh, discuss. Well, maybe because I had a cup of coffee and a tea break, I find myself feeling slightly more benevolent than I was at the end of the previous session. I think there are some questions that can be asked, which is, as there is no one, who's looking and what are they looking for? I've come across people who say that they have had benefit from self-inquiry, and when we've explored what that benefit was, it seems to me that benefit has been what I would call therapeutic. There's nothing wrong with that, absolutely. There's nothing right with it either. It is, that wonderful phrase, it is just what it is. Apart from that, I would say, as there is no one, who is there looking for themselves? Something to do, passes the time, has no more value and no less value than anything else, I would say. And I'd say, like many, many, many things, it's oversold in terms of the suggestion that it will do something which is a benefit to the non-person who discovers through self-inquiry, But, it's pretty popular, and I go back to that, what I already quoted Tony as saying before, T-Rec, I think I quoted it, that this non-duality, this kind of communication is reassuringly unpopular. So, if you want to come back on that, come back on it. Yeah.
I suppose within the non-duality circles, I tend to see, there's many types, but if I could make a distinction, I would say there's people maybe that talk a bit like you do, and then there's people that add in this, and then you do something like on the side, and that's usually something around self-inquiry from what I can see, something like that.
It's very popular. Yeah, there's no one who does anything, and now here's something you can do. And nothing wrong with it.
Nothing wrong or right.
Nothing right with it. Yeah. I feel like adding it is feeding the person, what the person wants.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason I said that, this is very naughty of me because you didn't ask me about this, but the well-known phrase or saying Eckhart Tolle just popped into my head. And that's the point at which I thought, it's feeding something that the person desires.
Yeah.
And so it's very popular.
Yeah.
This is not feeding something that the person desires.
Yeah. I suppose
I hope.
Yeah.
I hope.
Yeah. On that point, one thing that always confused me and stuck me when I used to listen to Tony was he would often use the word reinforce.
Yeah,
reinforcing, which you have to take with a bit of a pinch of salt, because the idea is that you're somehow blocking something.
Yes.
Which,
I kind of understand that, and yet also underneath that, I find myself saying, and that nothing can block this, and nothing can. Make it happen, if you like. That's a way of putting it.
Because it's just this.
So, self-inquiry is, if you like, just something that happens. Playing football happens, buying a new hat happens, self-inquiry happens, seeing there is no self happens, and seeing there is no self happen can arise when we're playing football, buying a new hat, or self-inquiry.
If anything, if you look at a lot of the spiritual stuff, like Eckhart Tolle, for instance, it seems to me a lot of that comes out of suffering.
Absolutely.
And we were talking about despair, weren't we?
Yes.
So this
He's
idea...
very good at
Yeah.
dealing with suffering on what I would call a psycho-spiritual or spirito-psychotherapeutic level.
Yeah.
Very good at what he does. I saw, I was watching a video of Eckhart Tolle's, and somebody asked a question, and a guy asked a question. He was very upset, and I completely empathise with this because he lost his dog. His dog had died, and I mean that can be a huge thing emotionally. I totally understand that, and he was obviously very, very upset and grieving. And he put this situation to Eckhart Tolle, and Eckhart Tolle sort of started talking. And in my memory, he talked for about 10 minutes, possibly a bit more, possibly a bit less. And his answer was wonderful, and it was so comforting, and just the kind of the core of it was that in some way the dog, although it had died, somehow nothing dies, and so in some way the dog still existed, and it was now part of the kind of the cosmic consciousness, the consciousness of all, and blah 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 blah. And as he spoke, the camera kept going backwards between him and the guy who'd asked the question, and you could see the palpable sense of relief on this man's face, and he was visibly relaxing as Tolle was speaking. It was a kind of, on that level, it was a brilliant answer. It was exactly what this guy wanted to hear, and of course it was total and utter tosh as well. So he's very, very good at doing what he does.
Yeah.
And the fact that it comes from Eckhart Tolle, he's being put up as a sort of guru, and when you go in there with all the admiration and all the expectations, that already starts to work on your psyche.
A bit like if you go to the Wembley Arena to see the Dalai Lama. I also think I quite like the Dalai Lama, but you've got this huge kind of expectation, so there's a lot of stuff going on psychologically and emotionally, and it may be genuinely very therapeutic. Nothing wrong with that. But in terms of what we're talking about, well, I've already used the phrase. How dare you? Yes. And if that goes out, if I put that up on YouTube, I might have to moderate the content and the comments very carefully.
Not yours or ours?
No, not mine.
The other thing with the self-inquiry is, like an Indian in a loincloth said it, so it must have some sort of meaning to it.
Yes.
The idea of appealing to tradition or authority, I suppose.
And the exoticism as well,
Yeah.
Particularly because so many of us for so long have been completely disenchanted with the Judeo-Christian blah blah blah, for very good reasons as well. So there's a kind of sense on the mind level to start looking at other traditions.
But also we are so conditioned just to live kind of neck up and in the head, that for some people to kind of stop that and just, focus inwards, in inverted commas, means that you start to see and experience something else as well. So, to really totally accept this seeing is really hard for the mind. So anything that sort of helps to, just say to the mind, okay, this can happen, and there's all kinds of things going on if you actually just look. So I wouldn't cross out self-inquiry in that way. Maybe I wouldn't call it self-inquiry, just inquiry, because it gives you a kind of mind practice to, not just to accept whatever is going, apparently going on out there. because there's more going on.
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately I'd say, self-inquiry, not self-inquiry, everything else, ultimately it is a complete mystery.
Yeah.
And whatever the mind makes of it,
Yep.
Because we're using words, we have to be exchanging mind stuff here as well, and it's all kind of beautifully, gloriously and utterly irrelevant. Yeah. Yeah. And whenever we find ourselves taking the mind stuff seriously, along may come the thought, feeling, apprehension after a while that that's a pretty silly thing to do. Divine, but useless. Yeah.
And nothing shuts the mind up better than facing the mystery. There's nothing you can say about it.
Well, going back to the initial talk before tea, yes, I mean that kind of, if it happens, that, even that split second of awakening is incredibly confronting us with the mystery. Yeah. Yeah. How can this be happening? How can there be experience with no one to experience it? And yet, incontrovertibly, that seemed to be the case. That's very confronting. Yeah.
I like the word confronting because it comes from the Latin. Con face means face to face. So it's like face to face confronting with reality, or non-reality, whatever you call it.
You could say for the first time we're face to face with reality at the point that it's seen that there is no us, there is no we, there is just reality.
It's ironic.
Yeah, and that's very confronting, and it tends to bring about, doesn't have to, but it tends to bring about huge changes in itself. Yeah. Including the possible collapse into despair, as I was talking about earlier. Yeah.
I'm stuck on something Ben said earlier about us not having free will, and I definitely agree that we don't have independent will in the way that we think we do. But there was something you said about, let's say, someone decides to harm someone in the room right now. I felt like what you were pointing towards was that that person doesn't have to take responsibility for that because there's no free will. And it brings up this question for me of, well, what about our discernment? What about, as humans we do have this ability that other living beings don't have, which is conscious awareness to discern or make choices. I'm curious, what you would say about that, because again, another worry I have is that this could stop people from having responsibility for their actions. If that makes sense.
It makes total sense. Let me start with two anecdotes, if I can remember both of them. By the time I get to the end of the first, I'll have forgotten the second. But never mind. Quite early on in my career as a speaker about this, I was giving a talk. It was actually a friend of mine who was sort of sitting in the front row, and she became somewhat outraged, in a nice way, not in a hostile way, with the suggestion about. Of course, don't forget, this is not saying there's no free will. It's much more radical than that. It's saying there's no one who could even possess free will. So forget it. And she said pretty much exactly this. She said, well, if what you're saying, that's terrible, because if what you're saying, then what is there to stop me going out on the street and starting murdering people? Which in one way or another is an objection that can come up quite a lot. And I said, well, there's two answer to that at the time. I think I only gave the first and most obvious one, which was simply, looking at you, this person who I'd known for quite a long time. It doesn't seem to me that you have the character of a murderer. I mean, that's the first and most obvious answer. If I don't have the character of a murderer, I'm not going to go out and start murdering people. The other answer I like, but I haven't come across it then, I don't often quote Mooji, but I really like this answer, which is, as I understand it, somebody put a pretty similar question to Mooji, why shouldn't I go out and kill people, if what you're saying is right? And he was saying, well, yeah, it's fine, go and kill people as long, because it's just a dream, and it's meaningless and it's a dream. Yes, sure, go and kill people as long as you don't mind being hunted down by the dream police and put in a dream prison. And I think, between them, those two answers are sort of fairly solid. But then I would add to that the thought or the feeling or the apprehension, because it's all of those things, there's a me that can choose to do that, is a misapprehension.
But discernment does happen and can happen, just like all the other characteristics that we have, they can happen.
But that choice is an illusion as well, because there's an infinite chain of causation that's happened since the beginning of time, and those apparent choices, this is the way Sam Harris and Robert Sapolsky explains it, those, you don't know where those come from either. So the impulse to get up and stab someone, or not, or that choice or whatever, is, the way he explains it is, if you go back to somebody who's had a lot of trauma in their childhood, you could say that was the cause. But all of that is, you can't stand outside of that chain of causation and act outside of that. That whole idea of free will it doesn't make any sense. It's like, it doesn't work rationally, because there's so many things that have happened before. So it's just, the whole thing is just, and also the other side of the coin is, there's no self anyway, so it's all just happening. That's the way I understand it. This
is what the Buddhists call conditioned arising.
Right,
That out of this arises this, arises this, arises this, back to infinity, if you like. And one of the things I like about that is it tends to lead to a much more compassionate morality than, we have a self and that self has free will, and therefore if I do this, I am to blame and I must be punished and da-da-da-da. So, for example, if you take like, I'm not going to go through all the 10 Commandments. God help us. God help us. But if you take some of them, like, for example, right, thou shalt not steal. So this is an injunction. This is a moral injunction, because you have free will and you have choice, right? If you take the Buddhist equivalent, and my understanding of this, that's my guarantee, my kind of... my insurance policy I'm taking out in describing what I'm going to describe this, is that it's not thou shalt not steal as a morality thing, but if taking things which aren't ours without permission happens, then this causes chaos and harm, and it's not going to contribute to a well-functioning society. So the story that I had long ago from a teacher, which I've never bothered to check whether it's right, but the story was, how did this arise? One day, I think, the Buddhist monks have to shave their heads every whatever it is. So we're talking about, in the Buddha's time, and one day the monk went to shave and he couldn't find his razor. So everybody has to spend time looking for the razor. Where is it? So there's chaos, and eventually another monk wanders up from the river and says, what's everyone doing? Oh, we're looking for so-and-so's razor. Oh, I've got it. I took it, And so the Buddha then says in the story I was told, the Buddha sits everyone out and says, look, you can see this doesn't work, so we're going to have a rule now that you don't take things which aren't yours without permission. Now that's taken all the punitive, thou shalt not steal out of, and don't start me on not coveting thy neighbour's ox, let alone his wife. Let's not even go there, but just this simple thing about taking a razor. So, in a sense, Buddhist morality is the same, because virtually all moralities are the same, because on that level we have evolved brains, and now it doesn't matter whether we're Buddhists or Christians or Hindus, our evolved brain functions in the same way. But on that level, you know, as a kind of story to explain why we do this and we don't do that in society, that's a much less punitive and a much healthier kind of story. And I've completely forgotten where that arose from, so if that doesn't fit the bill, tell me.
No, it makes sense. It does make sense. I definitely prefer the Buddhist
Yeah.
perspective on that, the
Yeah.
interdependence of everything. Yeah.
And also it stops that kind of, you know, getting up yourself about morality that religions tend to develop. So Christians claiming that kind of it's because of Christianity that we are moral people. I mean, of course not. Of course not.
Also, if there's a correlation between this and going out and killing someone, you would expect there to be statistically a high number of murderers sort of in this room and within the non-dual community. Because we've all absconded our rights to responsibility. So there'd be a link, you know, from the forensics to
Well, maybe there is, and no one's done the research.
Yeah.
A bit like the opposite. You know Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's thing in TM, that once you got 1% of the population meditating, then crime would stop. You know, and they proved it in, I think, wasn't it Hebden Bridge? Somewhere up north, they did manage to get the population who were meditating up to 1% of the population, and the crime figures dropped. But it turned out that it only dropped if you excluded certain very, very serious crimes from the statistics. And if you didn't exclude them, they haven't dropped. Yeah.
So now we need to find out if we're all murderers in disguise. Or not in disguise.
I forgot to mention.
But the idea that, you know, morality and good social behaviour comes from religion is absolutely absurd.
Right, yeah.
Absolutely absurd. I mean, it's kind of, you know, it's in our evolution. If we didn't have that from an evolution point of view, we wouldn't have developed into the sophisticated culture that we have.
Mm.
I heard a theory about religion that it was used by the priestly class, as a kind of threat about the afterlife.
Of course, yeah.
Because you didn't have them in this life, but if you said to them, in the future, you know, your sins will be punished, then you had to hold over people.
Yeah. Yes. As I have written in the book, I hope you've all read, you know, priests, popes and princes have always colluded with each other to oppress the people. Yeah.
That's why Descartes, when he was writing, he couldn't. I think he released his book after, because they had the Spanish Inquisition, and his whole thing was about the self separate from the state and the church. It was the start of basically liberalism and moving away from all of that. Because they were using it to control people.
Yes, seriously, you do not want to piss off the Spanish Inquisition.
The Monty Python.
Yeah. Yes. I'm just trying to reach for a quote. It's by a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. I think his name's Steven Weinberg, and he said there will always be good people who do good things and evil people who do evil things, but to get good people to do evil things, for that you need religion.
Wow.
Yeah. And I wish I could remember the exact quote, but I can't. But the oh God, what's his name? I've forgotten his name. Christopher, the guy where God took the wrong. Christopher Hitchens. Yes. Yeah, he wrote about this claim that the religious are more moral, he said, when, you know, many religious people, you know, do things which would have, I think it wasn't exactly this, but he said, you know, many religious people sort of do things that would have a brothel keeper or a slave trader raising an eyebrow, you know, yeah. Which is, of course, why so often the most popular American preachers are found in brothels with large piles of cocaine.
Bye, Ben.
See.
Oh, yes,
See you
yeah.
later.
All right, then.
Bye, nice to see you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Not that I'm suggesting that's always the case. That would be a terrible slander against American preachers.
Well, in today's political climate, I think that's a very appropriate description.
Richard, earlier you said something about the mind not existing. I wonder if you could say some more on that.
Well, it's just a stream. I mean, for simplicity, we could just call it the thought stream, as we're calling it the mind, or if we want to think of the mind in a wider term, just the stream of experience. So, there's a thought, and then a thought, and then a thought, and then a thought, and that's what we objectify it, we reify it, if you like. We turn that which is abstract, we consider it to be concrete. So the mind is simply, it's not a thing, it's a process, we could say.
A verb as opposed to a
It's a
noun.
verb as opposed to, I mean, it actually, we now know, I'm not going to go near quantum physics because I'll make a fool of myself if I do, except to say that we know now from quantum physics that there is only process. So this also is not a noun. The table is not a noun, it's a process. But it's easier to see that function in the mind than it is in the table. But back to the mind, and when I say thought, I mean a thought, an impression, whatever, you know. So if you like, it's a flowing energy, and we think there's something behind that giving rise to it, which is the mind.
And that's generating everything. That's creating the sense of time, identity, self is coming from that stream. So it doesn't exist.
Yeah, you could say it's generating everything, certainly our sense of time, our sense of self, our sense of place,
So is it that solidifying, what would you call it, the solidifying impulse that is what drops?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer that. There's something in me that slightly resists the word impulse, simply because to me that belongs to a kind of willing person, as in a person, not a person who's willing, but a person who wills things. So I wouldn't use that word impulse. It's more like a kind of, I was going to say natural, well it is natural, but an inevitable flow. Once this kind of bizarre divine puppet, whatever you want to call it, reaches a certain level of sophistication, there is this inevitable flow of, call it mind energy, if you like.
So there's like the movement or flow of thought stream.
Yeah.
And then there's a mechanism of solidifying. Like what is that? No.
It's not a mechanism of solidifying. What do you mean by solidifying? Do you mean like, when it becomes neurotic, for example, when the thought becomes recurring because it's neurotic?
Making it into my thought, mine.
Oh right,
Yeah.
yeah.
So there's a flow.
Yeah.
And then there's some mechanism that solidifies it.
Yeah. Again, I resist it. I mean, mechanism's a perfectly good word, but again, I resist it because it sounds mechanical rather than, But there's a kind of there comes a point, if you think in terms of a baby and their, biography, as it were, as they grow, there comes a point where what we think of as the sense of I, which is not a single thing, it's not a sense of I, it's a huge number of impressions, when that kind of separates out. So it's now no longer simply impressions happening in awareness, excuse the word. It's no longer that, it's impressions happening to me. It's my awareness that it's happening to me. You know, so mummy is now over there and I am here, and mummy has become a separate object.
Yeah.
But
That's just a natural forming
Yes.
of consequence,
Yes.
and then it's a natural dropping as well
Yeah.
of consequence.
Natural in the sense that it happens for almost but not quite everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it's not a thought.
No, well, it's far more than a thought.
Yeah.
It's like, I like this word contraction. It is like a physical contraction. And I mean, this is a metaphor I've dropped using, but I used to use it, I know, years ago when I was giving talks. That kind of, trying to get across the sense of this seeing, which is impossible to do. So I have two similar metaphors. One is, if you imagine sort of wearing a really tight corset, it's done up much too tight, but you were put in it the moment you were born. So it's always been how you've experienced life. So you don't know there's something unusual about it. You just take that as natural. Or an over-tight shoe, same thing. So that's just life. Life, an aspect of life is foot hurt. And then suddenly somebody comes along with a pair of big snippers and snips off that corset, and you go, ah! Or they do the same thing with the shoe. Or whatever, and suddenly you feel this sense of release and relief, and you think, oh my God. And then maybe there's the realisation that that sense of constriction was not the natural way of being. So that's what I'm suggesting for this. We kind of have that sense of constriction. It's so much a part of ourselves, we don't know it, we don't recognise it, we certainly don't feel it as constriction, because it's the natural way of being. When it's gone, it's like, oh my God.
And you can't see it or objectify it.
No.
So you have to use these metaphors like
Yeah.
clothing or constriction.
Yes, but it's not abstract. It's it's a felt sense.
And there isn't someone slipping it off either, and
No.
you can't slip it off either.
No, absolutely. But when it comes off, when the elastic bursts and the corset flies off,
It's like a carry-on film.
boy, yes, absolutely, with Barbara Windsor, I know. And when it comes off, flies off, boy, do you feel, boy, is that sense of relief felt. Yeah. So it's like from constriction to expansion. Yeah.
And there's a sense in which people can have a set experiences of that, or small awakenings.
Yeah. Anything can happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, no rules. Yeah.
So a little snip, but not all of it. That's the way I'm feeling right now.
I'd never thought of this, but if we pursue that metaphor, then yes, if there are kind of 20 elastic
I like this.
stays,
It's like
maybe
one little thing is
2 or 3 of
released.
them are snipped with a pair of nail scissors, or actually what we want is some garden shears. Maybe. Yeah.
Yes.
So this word mini awakenings, maybe, it's like some of that elastic giving way.
It's almost like you get the potential. You can feel the potential. That's not even the right word, but you can just. You're aware of the corset,
Yes.
but you can't get it off.
Yeah. Well, you
Because
probably.
you can't actually take it
You're
off.
probably not. No, you're not consciously aware of it even, because it's like this is how life's always been. And I've just the title of a book from decades ago has just popped into my head, and I think it was Ram Dass, but I'm not sure. Getting rid of what you haven't. Was that Ram Dass? Getting rid of what you haven't got. Maybe it wasn't Ram Dass, but definitely. It's one of the early spiritual Zenish. Getting rid of what you haven't got. That's what we're doing in a way. When we come to meetings like this, or we do our self-inquiry, or whatever it is, our meditation, we are trying to get rid of what we haven't got. Yeah.
And one of the quite frequent outcomes that it leaves you very childlike.
Yes.
Yeah.
Innocence.
Yeah.
Yeah. partly because the complex stories are seen through, and so there's just a kind of simplicity to everything. Yeah. Back to the ant crawling on the twig. And yet, you know, the complex stories may still be enjoyed as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's the benefit.
It's so annoying.
What's annoying?
It's so annoying that
What's
the
an-
self can't do anything about it.
Oh, it's a real piss off,
It's a
isn't
real
it?
bummer, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Very
I feel myself
frustrating.
is really pissed off right now.
Yeah, that's a very good sign. No, it is. It's very frustrating. Oh God, I can remember that. Talk about hitting our heads against the brick wall. It's like this metaphor came to me years ago. It's like, you know, we're trying to climb up the cliff wall of enlightenment by, you know, we bang on whatever it is mountaineers bang on, I've no idea. I don't think it's a crampon, but they bang something in. And then you haul yourself up on it. And then from that you bang one up higher and you crawl yourself up. You go on doing that till you quite sensibly and obviously reach the peak, which is great. The problem with this is you bang a lot of crampon in and you hang on to it, you haul yourself up and it just falls out of the cliff face and you land on your ass. And it goes on happening over and over and over and over again until maybe eventually some penny might drop and we stop hammering the pegs in and we stop trying to haul ourselves up and we just sit at the bottom of the cliff instead, maybe gently weeping to ourselves, maybe giggling, who knows, maybe in mystical contemplation, who knows. You know, and that's not better, but it's more relaxing. And so that's why often when people come to this, they have masses of questions at first and then the questions die away because they seem to be unanswerable. Yeah. I remember long ago, I went to, do any of you know Roger Linden? Anyone been to Roger Linden? So yeah. So years ago, I met up with a philosopher from, a genuine philosopher, as in a degree from Oxford. Ooh, that's a real philosopher. Met up with a philosopher friend of mine for lunch before a Roger Linden meeting, and you know we had lunch in a pub, and between us we cooked up the best question about death that we could think of between us, and believe you me, with one mighty mind, which was his, and me giving a little bit of help to it, you know, we came up with a damn good question about death, and that's it, we've got it now, we're going to find out now what the answer is. You know, how stupid were we? Of course we didn't get an answer, because there isn't an answer. It's, you know, not a real answer.
What was
We thought we were so clever, you know, this is gonna nail it. Nah, not a chance.
So what was the question?
Oh, I can't remember at this distance.
What is death? Whatever.
All I can say is it was pretty damn good. Of course we didn't get an answer. Questions about deaths tend to stop not when they're answered, but when it's realised they're unanswerable. So then the mind tends to give up again. And again, there's nothing right or wrong with that, it's just a bit more relaxing. And as I never tire of reminding everyone, relaxation is the key to Buddhahood here and now.
Say that again.
Keith Dowman, Buddhahood, relaxation is the key to Buddhahood right here, right now.
That's a good mantra.
It is, isn't it? It's a good one, yeah.
But you can also go on a sprint and relax. You can go on a sprint,
Oh, yes.
a marathon and
Yeah.
relax. So yeah,
Yeah.
relaxation, not just.
Well, I think that's the kind of intention that, you know, anything which is relaxing it's like, it's back to, it's Blake, isn't it? It's William Blake, you know, damn braces, bless relaxes. Yeah. We've got about 2.5 minutes for the ultimate killer question. Or not.
When are you back?
I don't know. We also do meet in London.
There isn't a question, is there? There isn't a question.
Well, no. There may be questions, but there isn't really a question. No. Oh, that's so profound. I feel almost like bringing us to a premature end, but I don't want to, you know, do us out of the possibility of that last killer remark in the last couple of minutes. I shouldn't have said that, should I? Because that really puts a lot of pressure on whoever says the next thing.
I like to end on love.
You'd like to end on love?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, just why is it unconditional love?
Yeah.
Why love and not cauliflower
Or bananas.
yeah.
Because that is a totally and utterly inadequate word, but it's still better than any other word when it's seen. Satchitananda, so Ananda, let's go back, let's be all pompous. I quite like that pomposity of going back to the Sanskrit ways. Ananda. Don't have to translate it as love, bliss, if you like. All-consuming bliss, unconditional love. Anything else you want to call it. If you want to call it cauliflower cheese, call it cauliflower cheese. Why? Because when this is absolutely seen, something is realised or seen which is ineffable. But if we're going to talk about it, we have to try and fucking F it. As I think it was Alan Watts said, you know, we're trying to F the ineffable. So given that we are doomed to failure because you can't F the ineffable, nevertheless we try, and if anyone can come up with a better phrase than unconditional love, we'll try it. Yeah.
There's
A sense of utter completeness, peace. The peace that, I mean, you know, I don't often quote from the Abrahamic religions for reasons that may or may not be obvious by now, but the peace that passeth all understanding. You know, and again, you know, 30 years of contemplation and theology will not get us anywhere close to that, and yet a moment of seeing. If it's full seeing that the underlying nature of this is unconditional love. Not soup, not gravy, not custard, but unconditional love. Is that a reasonable place to stop? Yeah, okay, we'll stop there. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.